Can you give an introduction to psychedelics, like a whirlwind overview? Maybe what are psychedelics and what are the kinds of psychedelics out there, and in whatever way you find meaningful to categorize?
Yeah. You can categorize them by their chemical structure. So phenethylamines, tryptamines, ergolines. That is less of a meaningful way to classify them. I think that their pharmacological activity, their receptor activity is the best way. Well, let me start even broader than that, because there I'm talking about the classic psychedelics. So broadly speaking, when we say psychedelic, that refers to, for most people, a broad number of compounds that work in different pharmacological ways. So it includes the so-called classic psychedelics. That includes psilocybin and psilocin, which are in mushrooms, LSD, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, it's in ayahuasca, people can smoke it too, mescaline, which is in peyote and San Pedro cactus. And those all work by hitting a certain subtype of serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. They act as agonists at that receptor. Other compounds like PCP, ketamine, MDMA, ibogaine, they all are, more broadly speaking, called psychedelics, but they work by very different ways pharmacologically. And they have some different effects, including subjective effects, even though there's enough of an overlap in the subjective effects that, people informally refer to them as psychedelic. And I think what that overlap is, compared to, say, caffeine and cocaine and, Ambien, et cetera, other psychoactive drugs, is that they have strong effects in altering one's sense of reality and including the sense of self. And I should throw in there that cannabis, more historically, like in the 70s, has been called a minor psychedelic. And I think with that latter definition, it does fit that definition, particularly if one doesn't have a tolerance.
So you mentioned serotonin. So most of the effect comes from something around like the chemistry around neurotransmitters and so on. So it's chemical interactions in the brain, or is there other kinds of interactions that have this kind of perception and self-awareness altering effects?
Well, as far as we know, all of the psychedelics of all the different classes we've talked about, their major activity is caused by receptor level events. So either acting at the post-receptor side of the synapse. So in other words, neurotransmission operates by, one neuron releasing neurotransmitter into a synapse, a gap between the two neurons, and then the other neuron receives. It has receptors that receives, and then there can be an activation caused by that. So it's like a pitcher and a catcher.
Yep.
So all of the major psychedelics work by either acting as a pitcher, mimicking a pitcher or a catcher. So for example, the classic psychedelics, they fit into the same catcher's mitt on the postsynaptic receptor side as serotonin itself. But they do a slightly different thing to the cell, to the neuron, than serotonin does. There's a different signaling pathway after that initial activation. Something like MDMA works at the presynaptic side, the pitcher side, and basically it floods the synapse or the gap between the cells with a bunch of serotonin, the natural neurotransmitter. So it's like the pitcher in a baseball game all of a sudden just starts throwing balls like every second.
Everything we're talking about, is it often more natural, meaning found in the natural world? You mentioned cactus. Or is it chemically manufactured, like artificially in the lab?
So the classic psychedelics, there's
what are the classics? So
yeah.
Using terminology that's not chemical terminology, not like the terminology you see in titles of papers, academic papers, but more sort of common parlance.
Right. It would be good to kind of define their effects, like how they're different. And so it includes LSD, psilocybin, which is in mushrooms, mescaline, DMT.
Which one is mescaline? Sorry.
Mescaline is in the different cacti. So the one most people will know is peyote, but it also shows up in San Pedro or Peruvian torch. And all of these classic psychedelics, they have, at the right dose, and typically they have very strong effects on one's sense of reality and one's sense of self. Some of the things that makes them different than other, more broadly speaking, psychedelics like MDMA and others is that they're, at least the major examples, there are some exotic ones that differ, but the ones I've talked about are extremely safe at the physiological level. Like there's like LSD and psilocybin, there's no known lethal overdose unless you have like really severe, heart disease, because it modestly raises your blood pressure. So
Right.
same person that might be hurt shoveling snow or going up the stairs, that could have a cardiac event because they've taken one of these drugs. But for most people, someone could take 1,000 times what the effective dose is, and it's not going to cause any organ damage, affect the brainstem, make them stop breathing. So in that sense, they're freakishly safe at the physiological. I would never call any compound safe because there's always a risk. They're freakishly safe at the physiological level. I mean, you can hardly find anything over the counter like that. I mean, aspirin's not like that. Caffeine is not like that. Most drugs, you take 5, 10, 20, maybe it takes 100, but you get to some times the effective dose and it's going to kill you.
Yeah.
Or cause some serious damage. And so that's something that's remarkable about most of these classic psychedelics.
That's incredible, by the way, that you can go on a hell of a journey in the mind, like probably transformative, potentially in a like deeply transformative way, and yet there's no dose that in most people would have a lethal effect. That's kind of fascinating. There's this duality between the mind and the body. It's like it's the okay, sorry if I bring him up way too much, but David Goggins is like the kind of things you go on a long run, like the hell you might go through in your mind. Your mind can take a lot, and you can go through a lot with the mind, and the body will just be its own thing. You can go through hell, but after a good night's sleep, be back to normal, and the body is always there.
So bringing it back to Goggins, it's like you can do that without even destroying your knee or whatever,
right?
or coming close and riding that line.
That's true. So the unfortunate thing about the running, which he uses running to test the mind, so the aspect of running that is negative, in order to test the mind, you really have to push the body, like take the body through a journey. I wish there was another way of doing that in the physical exercise space. I think there are exercises that are easier on the body than others, but running sure is a hell of an effective way to do it.
And one of the ways that where it differs is that you're, unlike exercise, you're essentially, most exercise required to really get to those intense levels. You really need to be persistent about it.
Right.
I mean, it'll be intense if you're really out of shape, just, jogging for 5 minutes. But to really get to those intense levels, you need to, have the dedication. And so some of the other ways of altering subjective effects or states of consciousness take that type of dedication. Psychedelics, though, I mean, someone takes the right dose, they're strapped into the roller coaster. And something interesting is going to happen. And I really like what you said about that distinction between the mind, or the contrast between the mind effects and the body effects, because I think of this. I do research with all the drugs, caffeine, alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, alcohol, legal, illegal. Most of these drugs, thinking about, say, cocaine and methamphetamine, you can't give to a regular user, you can't safely give a dose where the regular cocaine user is going to say, oh man, that's the strongest Coke I've ever had, because, you get it past the ethics committee and you need approval. And I wouldn't want to give someone something that's dangerous. So
Yes.
to go to those levels where they would say that, you would have to give something that's physiologically riskier.
Yeah.
Psilocybin or LSD, you can give a dose at the physiological level that is like very good chance it's going to be the most intense psychological experience of that person's life.
Yeah, that's
and
amazing.
have zero chance for most people, if you screen them, of killing them. The big risk is behavioral toxicity, which is a fancy way of saying doing something stupid. I mean, you're really intoxicated. Like if you wander into traffic or you fall from a height, just like plenty of people do on high
Yes.
doses of alcohol. And the other kind of unique thing about classic psychedelics is that they're not addictive, which is pretty much unheard of when it comes to so-called drugs of abuse or drugs that people, at least at some frequency, choose to take. You know, most of what we think of as drugs, you know, even caffeine, alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, most of these you can get into alcohol, you can get into a daily use pattern. And that's just so unheard of with psychedelics. Most people have taken these things on a daily basis. It's more like they're building up the courage to do it, and then they build up a tolerance, or they're in college and they do it on a dare. Can you take acid 7 days in a row, and that type of thing, rather than a self-control issue where you have and say, oh God, I got to stop taking this. I got to stop drinking every night. I got to cut down on the Coke, whatever.
So that's the classic psychedelics. What are the, what's a good term? Modern psychedelics, or more maybe psychedelics that are created in the lab? What else is there?
Right. So MDMA is the big one. And I should say that with the classic psychedelics, that LSD is sort of, you can call it a semi-synthetic, because there's natural, from both ergot and in certain seeds, morning glory seeds as one example. There are some very close chemical relatives of LSD. So LSD is close to what occurs in nature, but not quite. But then when we get into the other non-classic psychedelics, probably the most prominent one is MDMA. People call it ecstasy. People call it Molly. And it is it differs from classic psychedelics in a number of ways. It can be addictive, but not so. It's like you can have cocaine on this end of the continuum and classic psychedelics here.
Continuum of addiction.
Continuum of addiction. So it's certainly no cocaine. It's pretty rare for people to get into daily use patterns, but it's possible. And they can get into more like, using once a week pattern where they can find it hard to stop. But it's somewhere in between, mostly towards the classic psychedelic side in terms of like relatively little addiction potential. But it's also more physiologically dangerous. I think that certainly the therapeutic use, it's showing really promising effects for treating PTSD. And the models that are used, I think those are extremely acceptable when it comes to the risk-benefit ratio that you see all throughout medicine. But nonetheless, that we do know that at a certain dose and a certain frequency, that MDMA can cause long-term damage to the serotonin system in the brain. So it doesn't have that level of kind of freakish bodily safety that the classic psychedelics do. And it has more of a heart load, a cardiovascular. I don't mean kind of emotion. I mean, in this sense, although it is very emotional, and that's something unique about its subjective effects, but it's more of a oppressor.
And the terminology used in sort of like a freakish capacities, allowing you from a researcher perspective, but a personal perspective too, of taking a journey with say some of these psychedelics that is the heroic dose, as they say. So like these are tools that allow you to take a serious mental journey, whatever that is. That's what you mean. And with MDMA, there's a little bit, it starts entering this territory where you got to be careful about the risks to the body potentially.
So yes, that in the sense that you can't kind of push the dose up as high as you safely as one can if they're in the right setting, like in our research, as they can with the classic psychedelics. But probably more importantly, just the nature of the effects with MDMA aren't the full on psychedelic.
Got it.
It's not the full journey, So it's sort of a psychedelic with rose-colored glasses on. A psychedelic that's it's been called more of a heart trip than a head trip. The nature of reality doesn't unravel as frequently as it does with classic psychedelics.
But you're able to more directly sense your environment. So your perception system still works. It's not completely detached from reality with MDMA.
That's true, relatively speaking. That said, at most doses and of classic psychedelics, you still have a tether to reality. Right. Changes a little bit when you're talking about smoking DMT or smoking 5-methoxy-DMT, which are some interesting examples we could talk more about. But with with MDMA, it's for example, it's very rare to have a what's called an ego loss experience, or a sense of transcendental unity, where one really seemingly loses the psychological construct of the self. But MDMA, it's very common for people to have this, they still are perceiving themselves as a self, but it's common for them to have this warmth, this empathy for humanity and for their friends and loved ones. So and you see those effects under the classic psychedelics, but that's a subset of what the classic psychedelics do. So I see MDMA in terms of its subjective effects is, if you think about Venn diagrams, it's sort of MDMA is all within the classic psychedelics. So everything that you see on a particular MDMA session, sometimes a psilocybin session looks just like that. But then sometimes it's completely different with psilocybin. It's a little more narrowed in terms of the variability with MDMA.